At my husband's funeral, my daughter-in-law stood up and said in front of everyone, "Since Dad is gone, Mom has nothing. She'll be moving out today." Guests gasped as she laughed at me. But then the lawyer opened his briefcase and read a will that made her collapse. Before I tell you how it happened, make sure you subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. My name is Margaret Hayes. I am 69 years old, and I had been married to my husband, Michael, for more than 40 years. He was my partner in everything, kind, hardworking, and deeply respected in our community. Together, we built a simple but meaningful life, raising our son David and creating a home filled with love. When Michael passed away, my heart felt empty. Losing him was like losing half of myself. The day of his funeral, I walked into the church, holding on to memories that both comforted and hurt me. Friends, relatives, and neighbors filled the room, paying their respects. Everywhere I looked, I saw people whose lives Michael had touched. I sat quietly in the front row, dressed in black, clutching a small handkerchief. My son David sat beside me, though his wife Olivia was the one who carried herself like she was in charge. She moved about the room, talking loudly, making sure people noticed her. Even in that moment of grief, I could feel her coldness. Olivia was beautiful on the outside. Her heart was sharp. She cared too much about appearances, about who had money and who didn't. She often looked down on me because I lived modestly. Michael and I had always chosen a simple life, one that valued family over luxury. But Olivia never understood that. I wanted to believe that at least during the funeral, she would respect the moment. I was wrong. What happened that day shocked not just me, but every single guest who had come to honor my husband. The funeral service ended with a heavy silence. People wiped their tears, some hugged me softly, and others whispered kind words about Michael. I nodded, thanked them, and tried to hold my composure, though inside I felt like a fragile glass ready to crack. My husband was gone, and the weight of that reality pressed on me with every breath. After the closing prayers, we moved into the reception hall, where family and friends gathered for refreshments. It was supposed to be a moment of comfort, a time to share stories and honor Michael's life. Instead, it became the moment my daughter-in-law turned my grief into humiliation. Olivia stood near the center of the room, her heels clicking against the floor as if demanding attention. Her smile was thin, her voice sharp, as she raised it above the murmur of guests. "Now that Dad is gone," she announced, "things will be changing." The chatter died instantly. All eyes turned toward her. I froze where I stood, gripping the edge of the table to steady myself. Olivia glanced around the room with a smirk before locking her eyes on me. "Since Dad is gone, Mom has nothing. She'll be moving out today." Gasps erupted from the guests. A few hands flew to mouths, others whispered in disbelief. I felt my knees weaken, my stomach twist. My face burned with shame, but I forced myself to sit upright, refusing to crumble in front of them. My son David stood beside his wife, shifting uncomfortably. He looked down at the floor, unable to meet my eyes. His silence cut deeper than Olivia's words. I needed him to defend me, to say that I was his mother, that I deserved respect, especially on this day of all days. But he said nothing. Olivia's voice grew harsher as she continued. The house, the savings, everything was in Dad's name. And now that he's gone, there's nothing left for her. David and I will take care of things from here. Don't worry. She let out a laugh, a cruel sound that echoed in the hall. The room filled with uneasy whispers. One relative muttered, "How could she say that here?" Another shook their head and whispered to the person beside them, "Margaret doesn't deserve this." I sat in silence, my heart pounding. Tears threatened to fall, but I held them back. I would not give her the satisfaction of seeing me break. I folded my hands in my lap, my eyes fixed on the tablecloth, praying for the moment to pass. But Olivia wasn't finished. She stepped closer, her voice carrying even more venom. "We'll figure out where she can stay, maybe with a relative, or maybe we'll arrange something else. Either way, she won't be in the family home anymore." A wave of shame washed over me. That house wasn't just a building. It was the place Michael and I built together brick by brick, where we raised David, where every memory of our marriage lived. And now, in front of strangers and family, Olivia was throwing me out of it like I was nothing more than an old burden. I looked at David again, hoping for some sign of loyalty, some shred of courage, but he stood still, his lips pressed tight, his eyes glued to the floor. His silence was louder than her words. The guests were restless now, shifting in their chairs, whispering angrily. Some glared at Olivia, while others looked at me with pity. My humiliation was complete. I, the grieving widow, had just been stripped of dignity at my own husband's funeral. In that moment, my heart broke not only for myself, but for Michael. He had loved his family so dearly, worked his whole life to protect us, and yet the respect he gave so freely was not being carried forward. I whispered silently to him, "I'm sorry, Michael. I never thought it would come to this." I wanted to stand up, to speak, to defend myself, but my voice felt trapped in my throat, strangled by grief and shock. All I could do was remain still, holding onto my composure like a shield. Olivia, satisfied with her performance, returned to her seat, sipping her drink as though nothing unusual had been said. The guests remained in stunned silence, their eyes darting between me and her. The pain in that moment was indescribable. To lose my husband was already unbearable, but to be humiliated in front of friends and family by the very woman who had married into my family, it was cruelty I would never forget. And yet, as I sat there, broken but silent, I noticed a shift. Mr. Bennett, the lawyer who had been quietly present all along, straightened in his chair. He reached for his briefcase and placed it firmly on the table. His expression was calm, but his eyes burned with purpose. I realized then that Olivia might have spoken too soon. The conflict wasn't over. It was only beginning. As the guests sat in uneasy silence after Olivia's cruel announcement, my heart pounded in my chest. The weight of humiliation pressed hard on me, but I held my head steady, refusing to crumble. My son's silence was louder than Olivia's words, and I could feel the eyes of every guest burning into me, waiting to see if I would break. Then, a voice cut through the tension. It was calm, steady, and firm. "Before we move forward, I believe there's something that needs to be addressed." All heads turned toward the corner of the room, where Mr. Bennett, our longtime family lawyer, sat with his leather briefcase resting on his lap. He was an older man with graying hair, known for his composure and honesty. He stood slowly, adjusting his glasses, and walked toward the front where Olivia had made her bold claim. His shoes echoed against the floor, each step commanding attention. He set the briefcase down on the table, unclipped the locks, and opened it with deliberate care. The sound of metal clicking seemed louder than anything in the room. Guests leaned forward, whispering. Olivia rolled her eyes and muttered, "This is unnecessary. There's nothing to read." Dad didn't leave anything behind. Mr. Bennett ignored her and glanced at me. His eyes softened as he said gently, "Mrs. Hayes, I believe your husband wanted his wishes to be respected. He left behind a will, and with your permission, I'd like to read it now." My breath caught. Michael had left a will. He hadn't spoken of it in detail, but the idea that he had prepared something brought a rush of comfort I hadn't expected. I nodded, my voice barely above a whisper. "Please, go ahead," the guests murmured, shifting in their seats. Some looked relieved, others leaned closer in anticipation. Olivia laughed, shaking her head. "This is ridiculous. He had nothing. Whatever is in that briefcase can't change the fact that she doesn't own the house or the savings. Everyone knows that." Mr. Bennett straightened, his voice strong and measured. "That's exactly why I must read this now. Assumptions have caused enough harm today. It's time for the truth." He pulled out a thick folder of documents and placed them neatly on the table. The sight of the stamped official papers silenced the room. Olivia's smug smile faltered for the first time. Her eyes narrowed as she crossed her arms, tapping her foot impatiently, but I could see the unease growing in her posture. David shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the documents, then at me. For the first time since the humiliation began, he seemed torn, as though he wanted to speak but didn't know how. I looked at him, my expression calm, though my heart ached with disappointment. Mr. Bennet cleared his throat and began, "This will was prepared 5 years ago, signed and notarized under the law. In it, Mr. Michael Hayes made clear his intentions for his estate and for the protection of his wife." A wave of whispers swept through the room. Guests leaned toward one another, curiosity sparking like fire. Olivia's jaw tightened. "Protection of his wife?" she repeated mockingly, but her voice lacked the same strength it had earlier. Mr. Bennet continued, "Michael Hayes left explicit instructions that all his assets, including the family home, financial accounts, and additional properties, remain under the sole ownership of his wife, Margaret Hayes." The room gasped. A few relatives even clapped their hands over their mouths. Olivia's face paled, her smirk wiped away in an instant. She shook her head quickly, her voice rising. "That's not possible. He never told us anything about that. You must be making this up." But Mr. Bennet remained calm, flipping through the signed pages. "Here is his signature, and here the witness signatures. It is fully legal and binding." He turned slightly, addressing the guests as if to remind everyone present that this was not a matter of opinion, but of law. Olivia faltered, her voice cracking. This can't be right." She clutched David's arm, but he pulled away slightly, his face red with shame. For the first time since the funeral began, I felt a shift. The humiliation that had pressed so heavily on me began to lift. Michael had not left me alone, after all. Even in death, he had made sure my dignity and security were preserved. Mr. Bennet placed the will flat on the table and looked directly at me. "Mrs. Hayes, your husband loved you deeply. He ensured that you would be protected, no matter what. These were his wishes, and today they are honored." The guests erupted into whispers again, this time full of admiration. Some looked at me with respect, others with sympathy, but all with the understanding that Olivia's arrogance had been shattered. In that moment, I didn't need to say a word. The truth was unfolding on its own, and the woman who had laughed at me moments before was now trembling in disbelief. The turning point had arrived. The shame was no longer mine to carry. It was hers. The room was utterly still as Mr. Bennet's words hung in the air. For a few seconds, nobody moved. All I could hear was the soft rustling of papers as he adjusted the will on the table and the faint hum of the air. Conditioner. Then, like a wave, gasps and murmurs spread across the hall. People leaned toward one another, whispering, "Did you hear that?" Michael left everything to Margaret. I sat frozen, my hands trembling slightly in my lap. A flood of emotion surged through me. Relief, pride, and grief all at once. My Michael, even in death, had found a way to protect me. The humiliation I had felt only moments earlier began to dissolve, replaced with a steady strength I hadn't realized I still carried. Olivia, however, was unraveling before everyone's eyes. Her face had drained of color, her confident posture collapsing. She shook her head violently, her voice rising higher than before. "No, this isn't true. This isn't real. Michael wouldn't do this. He would never leave everything to her." She pointed at me, her finger trembling. "She's old. She's weak. She can't handle it." The guests recoiled at her words. A woman near the front row muttered sharply, "How dare she speak like that?" Another relative added, "Margaret gave her son everything, and this is how she treats her?" The judgment in their voices cut through the room. Olivia was no longer the woman in control. She was the one on trial. Mr. Bennet didn't flinch. He tapped the papers firmly. "This will is signed, notarized, and legally binding. Michael Hayes wanted his wife to be cared for, and he made that decision himself. These are his words, not mine." He paused, his voice lowering slightly. He also included a condition. The crowd hushed again. Olivia's eyes widened, her lips trembling. A condition?" Mr. Bennet nodded. "Yes. Should Margaret choose, she has the right to allow her son and his wife to remain in the family home, but only on the condition that they show her respect." The whispers grew louder, filling every corner of the hall. Some guests even gasped out loud. Olivia swayed slightly on her feet, her hand clutching the edge of a chair to steady herself. For a moment, I thought she might faint. Her arrogance, her certainty, had collapsed into dust. David finally lifted his head, his face red with shame. He looked at me, his eyes glistening. "Mom, I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know." His voice cracked as he spoke, the weight of his silence at the dinner and the funeral pressing visibly on him now. I looked at my son, my heart torn. I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't ignore how deeply his silence had cut me earlier. Still, I said nothing. It wasn't the time for my anger. It was the time for the truth to stand on its own. Olivia, desperate, tried once more to speak. This isn't fair. I married into this family. I gave my best years to David. Why should she get everything? Her voice wavered, sounding less like a demand and more like a plea. One of Michael's old friends, a man who had known us since our early days of marriage, stood and said firmly, "Because she's his wife. Because she stood by him for 40 years, through thick and thin. You've been here for what, 10? You haven't earned the right to take from her." Applause rippled softly through the crowd, not loud but steady, a quiet show of support that left Olivia visibly shaken. She sank into her chair, her face pale and wet with tears of humiliation. Her shoulders slumped, as if the weight of every judgmental eye in the room pressed down on her. For the first time, she looked small, stripped of her pride. Mr. Bennett closed the folder and looked directly at me. "Mrs. Hayes, your husband's wishes are clear. You are the rightful owner of his estate. You are secure, and no one can take that from you." Tears finally slid down my cheeks, but this time they weren't from shame. They were from gratitude. Michael had kept his promise. Even in death, he had found a way to protect my dignity. The guests began to approach me, one by one. Some offered hugs, others whispered, "We're so sorry for what she said to you." A cousin kissed my cheek and said, "Your strength is incredible, Margaret. You didn't have to say a word, and yet you've stood taller than anyone here." I looked at Olivia across the room. Her head was bowed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her body trembling with the shock of defeat. She no longer dared to meet my eyes, and I, sitting there in my modest black dress, felt a calm dignity settle over me. I hadn't shouted. I hadn't defended myself. I hadn't needed to. The truth had spoken louder than I ever could. When the lawyer's voice fell silent, and the weight of Michael's will settled over the room, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Peace. Not happiness, not triumph, but peace. My husband had spoken for me when I could not. He had protected me when others thought I was powerless. And in that moment, the humiliation Olivia had thrown at me was no longer mine to carry. As the guests slowly began to leave, many of them approached me. Some took my hand, others hugged me softly, and a few whispered words I will never forget. "You've carried yourself with grace," one said. "Michael must have loved you so much to think this far ahead," another added. Their words didn't erase the pain of what had been said to me earlier, but they reminded me that I was not alone. People had seen, people had judged, and in the end, truth had stood on my side. Across the hall, Olivia sat slumped in her chair, her perfect posture gone. Her eyes were red from tears she didn't want anyone to see. A woman who had entered the room so sure of herself now looked smaller than ever. No one pitied her. No one whispered kind things to her. Her arrogance had built her up in front of the crowd, but her arrogance was also what had shattered her in front of the same crowd. David lingered by the doorway, unsure whether to stay or follow his wife. He finally walked over to me, his face pale, his eyes filled with regret. He sat beside me and spoke in a voice only I could hear. "Mom, I'm sorry. I should have defended you. I should never have let her say those things. I failed you." For a moment, I didn't answer. My heart had been broken, not just by Olivia's cruelty, but by David's silence. Finally, I turned to him and said softly, "You are my son. I will always love you, but silence can wound deeper than words. Remember that." His eyes filled with tears as he nodded. "I understand. I'll do better. I promise." I believed him, not because of his words, but because I could see the shame in his face. The days that followed were not easy. Olivia avoided me completely. She couldn't bring herself to face me, and when she did speak, it was short and cold. Her pride had been cracked in front of everyone, and she couldn't forgive herself, or me, for it. But that was no longer my burden to carry. Her choices were hers. My dignity was mine. Family members called me often, checking in, offering support. Cousins and neighbors who had been present at the funeral now spoke of me with admiration. Margaret stayed silent, but her silence was more powerful than shouting. That phrase seemed to travel from house to house, and though I never sought recognition, it comforted me to know that people saw the truth clearly. One evening, as I sat in my quiet home, I lit a candle by Michael's photo and whispered, "You kept your promise. You said you would protect me, even when you were gone, and you did." I let the tears fall, but they were not tears of humiliation this time. They were tears of gratitude. The biggest lesson I carried from that day was simple yet profound. Respect is not given because someone demands it. It is earned by the life you've lived, the love you've given, and the sacrifices you've made. Money, appearances, and pride fade, but dignity remains. Olivia had tried to strip me of mine, but the truth had restored it in front of everyone. I chose not to hate her. I chose not to dwell on her cruelty. Instead, I carried forward with my head high, knowing that I had lived with grace and that Michael had honored me with his final act of love. The family dynamics would take time to heal. David would need to prove that he had learned from his silence. Olivia would have to face her own reflection and decide what kind of woman she wanted to be moving forward. But as for me, I was done fighting for my place. I already had it. In the end, I realized that life gives us moments when we are tested, not by what we say, but by how we carry ourselves when others try to diminish us. And sometimes silence is not weakness. Sometimes silence is strength. If you believe every parent deserves respect and dignity, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from.